Tonight I'll read Chapter 19, Cutthroat. With a growl, Longlost flung the knife across the room and stalked away across the chamber. Emily felt suddenly faint and would have fallen if Sam hadn't stepped forward to support her. Aaron looked at the two of them in bewilderment and busied himself tying up the pinwheels to the makeshift jetty. "Now what?" asked Sam quietly. "Stay here," Emily whispered shakily. "I'll go after her." "Is that wise?" "I need her to tell me how to get into the Abbey. Otherwise, how can I help my dad? Things don't seem to be going too well. I still have to try." Sam nodded. "Take care." He wandered over to Aaron. "Let me tell you about the treasure," he said. "No one else seems interested." Aaron looked at him blankly. Then he raised his eyebrows. "Go ahead." Emily watched as they started a hesitant conversation. Then she followed Longlost's path across the chamber to a wide flight of stone steps leading upward to the balcony. She wiped the blood from under her chin and started up the stairs, still a little shaky, but determined to face Longlost and try and get the information she needed. The fact that Longlost had thrown the knife away and not carried out her threat gave Emily some faint hope that all was not lost between them. At the top of the stairs, the balcony ran around the bottom of the stained glass dome. One of the doors leading off it was ajar. Emily was surprised to find that behind it a set of spiral stairs led upwards. She headed up, guessing that it led up to some kind of tower. She climbed for several minutes before the stairs led up into a small domed room with a curious metallic green roof that curved down towards the wooden floor. Susie Longlost was standing with her back to Emily, looking down through a small window set in the roof, her body tense. Emily could feel the anger emanating from her like a solid force. Emily stood quietly in the opposite corner, oppressed by Longlost's mood and unable to break it. Suddenly Longlost turned around and faced her, her eyes glittering and her face fierce. "You know why they call me Cutthroat?" she demanded. Emily stared at Longlost. Her hand went involuntarily up to the wet spot of blood under her chin. "Because of what you do to people?" Longlost tore the scarf away from around her throat and threw it to the floor. "Because of this." A ragged line of scar tissue ran completely across Longlost's throat. Emily couldn't take her eyes off it. How had Longlost survived that? She shuddered. "My mother did that to me when I was 4, said Longlost. "She did the same to my kid brother, and to herself. I'm the only one she did a bad job on." Emily struggled to take that in. Longlost's own mother? "She left a note saying that everything was bad, and we all needed a fresh start." Longlost laughed bitterly. A fresh start. Emily felt like someone had twisted a knife in her chest. "My mother left me too," she said. She felt a well of grief begin to tear open inside her. "I didn't even get a note. She just left. I can barely remember her." Longlost looked at her. "You too? And Sam's mum left him." Longlost put her fingers on the scar on her throat. "You're a brave girl," she said to Emily. Emily shook her head. "I just want to help my dad." "And you need to find a way into the Abbey to do that?" Emily nodded. "And these things, these Wyrms, they really exist?" Longlost looked at her searchingly. "They do. I'm going to stop them." Longlost stared at her, then her eyes started to smile. "You might at that. You're a determined little thing." Her eyes narrowed. "Why do you want to get into the Abbey?" "The monks have some kind of holy object that I need to use to destroy the wormwell," Emily explained. "They keep it in the Abbey." Longlost suddenly looked furious again. "I don't believe you." Emily wondered what she'd said wrong this time. "The monks are good people. They can't be doing what you say." Longlost pointed her finger at Emily accusingly. "You're wrong." "How do you know? About the monks, I mean." Emily suddenly put two and two together. "Oh, you didn't just get into the Abbey, did you? You actually met one of them." She saw the faint blush spread across Longlost's face, and added in a moment of inspiration, "You met a boy." Longlost's face fell into misery. Her arms dropped to her sides, and she sat down heavily on the floor, her back against a support pillar, her hands clutching at her wet hair. Emily was becoming used to long-lost lightning changes of mood. She walked over to the crumpled girl and tentatively put her hand on her shoulder, then sat down on a crossbeam nearby. "I didn't meet him in the Abbey," said Longlost sadly. "I met him here, in this church. That's how I found this place. I was angry and depressed and looking for somewhere dark and horrid to hide in. I was in the backwater we came down earlier, and I heard this voice singing, a beautiful voice. I followed it and found the tunnel into the church." Emily nodded. "He came to the church to sing and pray. I just watched him at first. I didn't want to scare him away. He was young, only a couple of years older than me. He came to the church quite frequently. I'd hide and wait for him. Eventually he guessed that someone was watching him and demanded that I show myself." Longlost gave a small smile. "His face when he saw me. I'd never seen eyes so wide." She grinned. "I told him to frog off and find somewhere else to sing. That this was my church." Emily laughed. "His name was Stephen Pilgrim. He was 18, 2 years older than me. I'm not sure he'd ever met a woman before. He seemed terrified of me. But at the same time he was so at peace. Being with him was like being on a rock whilst all around a flood tore the world apart. So once I'd agreed that he could come back to my church, we got on quite well." Emily raised an eyebrow. Longlost blushed again. "Very well. We talked a lot. He was nervous about kissing to begin with, but he got the hang of it." "How did he get out of the Abbey?" "After a few months I asked him. He didn't want to tell me, which made me upset. He didn't know what to do about that." "I bet," thought Emily, "if you'd spent your life quietly locked up in an abbey, having Susie Longlost suddenly land in the middle of it would be like being caught in a thunderstorm and a blizzard and a wildfire all at the same time. I think he had one way out of the Abbey and another way back. I wanted to see what it was like in the Abbey, to see where he came from, but he refused to let me go back with him. That made me angry, like I wasn't as important to him as his life back there. One day I kept asking him, and finally I made him angry too, and he just left." "And you followed him?" Longlost nodded. She pointed across the room to a loose panel in the roof. "There's a way through there, across the rooftops. I followed him. It's not an easy route, and at the end, even though I saw him do it first, the way to cross the Abbey moat and into the Abbey itself is just madness. But I did it." "You got in?" "I did. I followed him to his room." She laughed sharply. "You never seen an expression like the one he had when he saw me there, angry, terrified, but pleased as well, all at the same time." She stopped and looked unutterably sad. "I never knew why he was pleased though, because a few minutes later he betrayed me." "He did what?" Emily was appalled. "He betrayed me," Longlost said softly. "When I got to his room we argued. I got angry and told him that he had a decision to make, me or the Abbey. He seemed confused. He was shaking. Eventually he just ran out of the door. And he didn't come back. Like a fool I waited for him. But a few minutes later a group of old monks came and kicked me out of the Abbey. They told me that Stephen said he didn't want to see me ever again." Her face was desolate. Emily knew of no words that would be of any use in comforting her. Longlost wiped her face in her sleeve and stood up shakily. "Well," she said, her voice thick, "you've got what you came for. He marked the route to the Abbey with a sign of upwelling. You can't miss it." She glanced at something on the floor and then started down the stairs, her face expressionless. Emily picked up the thin piece of cloth that Longlost had left lying on the floor. It was her neck scarf. Emily dropped it in her pockets, then followed Longlost down the spiral stair, her emotions churning. In the pool chamber, Sam and Aaron were still talking. Although Aaron still looked sudden, his eyes were bright with excitement. "He says they found a map to a hoard of buried treasure," Aaron said to Longlost. "It's—" Longlost frowned and shook her head. "It's—" She held her hand up for silence. She seemed to be listening to something. No one spoke. In the quiet, Emily strained to identify what it was Longlost had heard. The scratching sound from high above them on the roof? The distant sound of a barge horn? The faint sounds of Maeve in the back room? Then she heard it. Strange echoes coming from the entrance tunnel across the pool, like the rhythmic splashing of a pinwheel, but intermittent and jerky as if the engine kept cutting out, faint at first, but quickly becoming louder. Emily gasped as a pinwheel spluttered out of the tunnel carrying the skinny boy Joni. He was clutching the steering column desperately with one hand, his other arm cradled protectively across his stomach. His nose was bloody, and an eye was swollen and bruised. His breathing was ragged and hoarse. They all looked at him in horror. "Run!" he cried. "They're coming! Run!" But before they could even move, shadows fell across them, and the glass dome above them exploded into a rain of multicoloured splinters as Black Cloud Warden smashed through it and started to abseil down towards them. "Don't move! We have you surrounded! Stay exactly where you are." And that's the end of chapter 19. Good night.